We're in a 21-day total quarantine lockdown thanks to a COVID outbreak in my apartment building as I write this, so I can't leave my apartment or go anywhere. So a friend and viewer of the channel suggested I watch and review some biblical epics from the 50s and 60s, which is a strange thing because I'd already planned at some point to do a video about historical epics being a bit of a dead genre. With that in mind, I watched 10 Commandments from 1956 to see what, if anything, we can learn as to why the biblical epic, especially, and epics in general, as a genre, are largely dead. As always, let's start at the very beginning, which in this video's case is with the very genre at hand, epics. What are they? Why were they so popular in the 50s and 60s? And why are they kind of dead? Turns out that is probably the hardest question to answer because nobody can truly agree on what constitutes an epic, or if it is even a genre of movie unto itself. But most people agree it is a style of filmmaking that employs a large scope, scale and spectacle. Epics are usually, but not always, set within a historical time of importance that has far-reaching societal and cultural effects, with the central character being vitally important to those being brought about. They are also usually very long, at least over 2 hours, as they cover a large time span, sometimes even multi-generational spans of time within their narrative. They also have specially designed costumes, large ensemble casts, and are shot on location with large-scale battles employing many extras, large-scale sets, and special effects. Due to this, they tend to be some of the most expensive films to make. Seeing as the definition is so vague and nebulous, such films as Avatar, 300, Avengers Endgame and Star Wars could be considered epics, just not by me. Personally, when I think epic, I think grand historical dramas such as Ben-Hur and Lawrence of Arabia. If you agree or disagree, please let me know in the comments. There are, like most things in life, various reasons behind the popularity of epics in the 50s and 60s. Firstly, epics are one of the oldest film genres, with the first dating all the way back to Giovanni Pastroni's Cabiria from 1914, and they had always been a hugely popular genre of film, so the popularity in the 50s was just a continuation of this popularity. Secondly, the Hays Code was a strict, largely religiously motivated system of censorship that was strictly enforced at the time and meant you couldn't show anything, yeah, literally anything. Sex, violence, skimpy clothing, the Hays Code says no. Except if that was in a biblical setting, and the people doing the naughties were then punished, and all the naughty things they were doing showed just how evil they are, then the censors tended to let it pass. Hence a lot of filmmakers took advantage of this and made flicks about biblical narratives so that they could show some sordid action and violence. But thirdly, and probably most importantly, is the fact that TV was starting to infringe on cinema's turf. But the studios had an ace up their sleeve that TV at the time did not. They could produce movies and spectacle on a scale and grandeur that TV could not even dream of competing with, that were also in colour, something again TV couldn't do at this time. So they made epic scale historical dramas set in stories that people would understand, know and love. The Bible is, after all, probably one of the oldest, longest running Western story franchises around. Even I, an absolute atheist, know of the story and character of Moses and the 10 Commandments without even having to see the film. The length of the movie wasn't a turn off to audiences back then either, because prior to the 50s and the rise of television, a ticket to the cinema bought you admittance to a short, usually a cartoon, a newsreel, an A movie and a B movie, so you were used to getting 3 to 4 hours of entertainment for your buck. Before we can answer that question, let's watch an epic. I usually only cover cult schlock, so this is entirely different to anything I've covered ever before on this channel. But he's also weirdly very much in my wheelhouse because I watched a lot of epics as a kid. So as usual, let's take a look back at the basic background of the Ten Commandments, which is a 1956 epic religious drama film written, produced, directed and narrated by Cecil B. DeMille, this being his last and financially most successful film before his death. It is based on various novels: The Prince of Egypt by Dorothy Clark Wilson, The Pillar of Fire by J.H. Ingraham, An Eagle's Wings by A.E. Southern, and of course the Book of Exodus from the Bible. It also acts as a partial remake of DeMille's earlier 1923 silent era film of the same name. It is of course a dramatisation of the biblical tale of Moses, his life as an adopted Egyptian prince, the discovery that he is in fact the son of a Hebrew slave, his banishment into the deserts of the Sinai Desert, and of him ultimately leading the Hebrews to the Promised Land. This was the most expensive film ever made at the time of its release, costing $13 million, or around $127 million in today's money. It is, however, also one of the most successful films of all time, grossing $122.7 million, which in today's money is around $1.2 billion. It also received 7 Oscar nominations, winning 1 for special effects. Critical response has been hugely positive over the years, with Bosley Crowther writing in the New York Times saying, "In its remarkable settings and decor, including an overwhelming facade of the Egyptian city from which the Exodus begins, and in the glowing technicolor in which the picture is filmed, Mr. DeMille has worked photographic wonders. Even after 6 decades, this picture looks amazing. The sets are, for want of a better word, epic in scale and grandeur, with an entire facade of an Egyptian city having been built on location in the Sinai Desert in Egypt, being the standout of the massive and hugely impressive sets they built. The vistas are captured in glorious wide focus lenses, giving them even more scale and really selling the epic scope of this story. The costumes are absolutely sumptuous, being exquisite, sexy reimaginings of what people wore in biblical times, all golds and bright blues and reds. The special effects, which were cutting edge at the time, have obviously not aged quite as well, with the very early blue screen technology being really noticeable when it is used, because the process left a noticeable border of black/blue around its edges. But for the time it must have been mind-blowing seeing large-scale Egyptian cities and palaces being brought to life to this scale on the big screen. That's the beauty of largely filming on location with a blend of miniatures, full-scale sets, matte paintings and special effects. It essentially makes your film timeless, which is definitely the case here, I think. I know I say this every week, but purely using CGI really is rubbish, and ages about as well as a racist joke. The feeling I got from watching this is one of watching a very elaborate 4-act play. The acting from Heston and Brenner is especially hammy and over the top like you'd see in a stage play, as is the way the film is largely shot, in wide aspect locked off tripod shots, cutting occasionally to close-ups of the actors to put emphasis on a particularly powerful line. It gives you the sense of being sat on the very edge of a stage. Hell, the film even has an intro by the director and an intermission, just like many plays do. It is still, even now, a very watchable film and a timeless masterpiece of cinema, but it does reveal a few reasons as to why the biblical epic, and epics in general, have died. Cecil B. DeMille was obviously a very committed Christian or deeply religious man, and the narrative here is entirely told through the eyes of a true believer, which as an atheist led to several questions, or should I say obvious plot holes, and the first reason epics, especially biblical ones, have kind of died. Like when the Pharaoh says this,
"What gods? You prophets and priests made the gods that you may prey upon the fears of men. The Nile ran red, I too was afraid. Was it the wonder of your God that fish should die and frogs should leave the waters? Was it the miracle that flies and lice should bloat upon their carrion and spread disease in both man and beast? These things were ordered by themselves, not by any god. Now go.
And it leaves me thinking to myself that actually the Pharaoh is right, with the hindsight of 2,500 years of science. Or when he says this,
His God is God.
And you can't help but think, well, if he is the one true God, why then did the Egyptians stick to their gods for another 2,000 years that they know aren't real anymore? There are numerous examples throughout the film, some of which had me in fits of laughter, like when Heston comes down from Mount Sinai and he now has a glorious beard and hair, and his wife says this.
Look at his face.
He has seen God.
Narratively, it makes very little sense unless you are a true religious believer, and that I think is the first reason epics, especially biblical ones, have fallen out of fashion. Culturally, religious narratives just aren't as relevant as they used to be, and people really would be left scratching their heads at the obvious plot holes if you made something as sincerely and overtly religious today for a mainstream audience. Even purely historical narratives seem to have largely fallen out of mainstream popularity these days, which is why when epics are made, they are usually smaller in scale, narratively, and based upon a true documented historical story, or more likely are set in a fictional fantasy and or sci-fi setting. The second reason I can glean from viewing this movie is I have seen this film probably 20 times over the years, but this is the first time I've ever really sat down and watched it. In the past, it was something that was on in the background on public religious holidays and absorbed through osmosis, essentially. In other words, people's viewing habits have changed. People don't generally watch 4-hour-long films anymore. They certainly don't go to the cinema and expect a whole afternoon's worth of entertainment. Linked to that is TV is now where people turn for their epic storytelling. Game of Thrones, etc. have taken the place of the cinematic epic. They can compete with the scale and grandeur and tell even more massive epic scale stories over multiple seasons now. Finally, this film would probably be a studio mandated trilogy, each 2 hours long, because money, as seen in such film trilogies as The Hobbit, which could and should have been one epic 4-hour adventure. Instead we got 3 very boring stretched out films. You'd probably get the following trilogy out of the 10 Commandments. The first about Moses' life as a royal Egyptian prince, going up to him being banished to the deserts of the Sinai. The second would cover him speaking to God, his return to Egypt, and the 7 plagues that God unleashes upon the Pharaoh and his people, with the third covering the actual exodus from Egypt right up to them reaching the promised land. So that was the 10 Commandments and the death of the epic. Epics haven't really died, they've just changed with the times and adapted to modern cultural and societal mores really, moving from the cinema to the small screen and from historical biblical narratives to sci-fi and fantasy ones. As always, if you enjoyed that, then please do like, comment and subscribe. Next week is the Omega Man.